would have been, you would have been caught up in the frustration of it, at one very practical level, the futility of it, and yet what struck me right at the end was the power of that moment where these two former enemies are crying together, having spent this time, in Brian's case 9 years, with help from the Vietnamese, to actually find these dead soldiers to return them to their families. Very powerful moment.
Yeah. It wasn't a Hollywood ending by any means at all in terms of, they find the bodies and everyone was happily ever after, but it was that quiet bond between Brian's translator, as it turned out, Mr. Bin, the Vietnamese man. He was as tough as nails in terms of the shoot and my getting to know him and so on. Born in a North Vietnamese army camp. His mother was a medical doctor in the North Vietnamese army at the time of the war. Father was a soldier as well, so he was a kid born in an army camp. At the moment, doesn't like the communist system and the government and the way it's gone. Works with the Australian Embassy as the military attache's translator. But on that human level, that Brian connected with both Bin and Colonel Viet, the pint-sized mission in action former officer that befriended Brian and helped him in the dig and said, "No need to say sorry, Brian. You've done your best." It was that humanity of, as you said, of former enemies coming together. And what I really like about Brian is that, unlike a lot of his compatriots who've never been back to Vietnam, who say, Vietnam is a closed chapter, they're all stuck in that trauma of the war, mates that they lost, their innocence of youth that dried up, being despised when they came back to Australia because they were seen as baby killers, even though they did what their government required of them by registering for national service when their marble came up, or if they were regular soldiers, that's what they signed up for. A lot of those guys who are in caravan parks now, or isolated islands or bush settings that have just taken their marbles and gone home and not handling it well.
Worse than that, isn't it?
Killing themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what was it? Because trying to evaluate a story like that and trying to assess what was the value going to be of committing to a documentary, you've got to sustain the length, you've got to build the sequences, you've got to make sure that the dynamics are going to work. So fundamentally, you've got to be convinced about the story. What was it? What was it that got you across the line and committed you to making this documentary?
A number of things. I think that the actual genesis of the film is quite interesting itself, and I won't go on too long about it, but Brian came to a masterclass that I was giving in Fremantle in April 2012, having read a little story in the West Australian, an inch by an inch column that David Bradbury, who made Frontline, was in Perth, and we're giving a masterclass on this particular Saturday morning. And I saw him as the 30 filmmakers and wannabes turned up and were bustling to get into the situation. I was also trying to get my act together, like you saw me tonight, with buying time, trying to get the camera, telling my son Dylan what to do and getting the sound right, all that sort of stuff. I picked him in one because he was standing tall and well-dressed and well-coiffured with a short beard and a blue metal folder under his arm. So
and you went,
here we go again. Now, here's someone that thinks that David Bradbury can just pick the money off the public broadcasting tree and get $300,000 or whatever like that to make a film about the cat's home of Albany, Western Australia, he wants to save, or something other like that. And so, as I was a bit rattled, and he started to talk to me about being a conscript in Vietnam and bodies and missing bodies and enemy bodies. At that point, when he said enemy bodies, of course, you know yourself, Kerry, when people go outside of the norm and talk, as a journalist who's seen a lot of stuff when people start speaking outside of the predictable, then your antenna goes up. And when he started talking about enemy bodies, I could understand a Vietnam vet going back and looking for Australians that were killed in Vietnam and mates that they want to bring back or repatriate to Australia. And interestingly enough, there's not one Australian missing in Vietnam. All the remaining 6 were brought back a number of years ago. But as we saw at the end of the film, there's over 300,000 North Vietnamese soldiers, Communist soldiers, and an unknown number of South Vietnamese anti-Communist soldiers whose graves are unmarked. So when he started talking about that, I stopped him in his tracks. And ironically, the title of the masterclass was what the adage I got from Neil Davis that you mentioned at the start of this evening: keep the camera rolling no matter what. And it's something that you know, I know, is easy to say, but it's bloody hard to actually do in reality, because you've got politicians that don't want their skullduggery exposed, and people who don't want their emotions to be shown on camera as a current affairs news reporter or whatever. But I stopped Brian in his tracks and I said, look, I'm about to go in and speak to 30 students of film, and the theme of it is about how I make a film from day one in the camera. And I said, would you be prepared to be, I didn't say guinea pig, but would you be prepared to be the subject of the interview and show how I do that? And I said, look, knowing that Vietnam vets are pretty traumatised people at the best of times, I said, if there's anything you don't want to talk about, it's too close to the bone, I'll respect that, we'll move around it, and we'll keep on talking about other stuff. Rubbed his beard and he said, give me a minute to go and put some dollar coins in the parking meter outside and I'll come and join you. And then basically that's how the interview that you saw in the film evolved from that. 4 hours later, with the editor running out to his car to get an SD card that put in the back of the camera and getting his laptop and downloading it and giving a small card space to keep the camera rolling no matter what. I basically had the guts of the film, and Brian's traumatised experience in Vietnam, his brother killing himself, and the whole sort of story.
Do you think, get to the heart? What is at the core of his own personal nightmare? What is it, do you think, that's caused this knot in his gut for all these decades? Was it directly to do with those bodies in that mass grave? Was it about his own sense of trauma in the process? Was there shame? I mean, what were the things that you thought were right at the heart of what was gnawing at him?
I think he was a very sensitive, intelligent man that had basically what we call a nervous breakdown. And what we now call post-traumatic stress or shell shock in the age of our grandfathers and our uncles and fathers that fought in the First and Second World Wars. And he couldn't compute it when he came back. He couldn't compute it. I actually wanted to call the film Wandering Souls, and the ABC wouldn't let me call it that because they thought it sounded like a religious program that people would turn off in droves of watching it when it's on TV. But for me, Brian is as much a wandering soul, even though he's alive and he's got his physical presence. His spirit, his soul, is back in that trench in 1968 where he lost his innocence and lost his, in one sense, his sanity.
And it was interesting too, the element talking about the spirit world that is so important to the Vietnamese, and that alongside with that kind of communist ideology, there's a little bit of a kind of clash of things going on there. But how committed did it seem to you that the North Vietnamese were to see this grave found, to see these bodies found?
Well, they're very committed to helping Brian because they have that strong belief system of their comrades, what they call martyrs, and they want them found. And it's been suggested that maybe the bodies have already been found in that clean-up after 75 when the North rolled the South and so on. But I don't think, given the level of cooperation that Brian had from the government, who provided the $5 a day by 20 diggers on the number of digs that, there was actually 2 digs that I filmed in Brian. We telescoped into one for the sake of the film. They know everything that that happens in that country, and there's no way that they would let that happen if they knew that the bodies were found. So they were actually cooperating to help us find that, and they wanted those bodies found as much as Brian wanted them to be found.
Okay.
He received to document the end of his search, so he let go and you let go.
I think he the reason he engaged in the search was that he fell in love with Vietnamese culture. As the film said, when he went there in 2002 on a tourist visa, pretending he'd never been to Vietnam before, fearing that there might be reprisals. Can you imagine a Japanese son of a Japanese officer or a Japanese soldier coming to Australia, even 20 years after the war, the way that we hated the Japanese with what they did with our soldiers in Second World War and Changi prison and so on like that. Brian went back with that sort of mentality, but the Vietnamese so embraced him, and anyone that's been to Vietnam in this room would know that Vietnamese are very forgiving people, incredibly forgiving, given how much they suffered, how many bombs were dropped on them, Agent Orange and so on. Just a little small vignette. The colonel that's in the film that said, whenever I saw the enemy, I just wanted to fight. I got to know him a little bit in the 2 or 3 trips I went out to his home, 40 kilometres north of Hanoi, and his children, all 5 of them, have got Agent Orange deformities, and that was because he was doused by Agent Orange in the jungles of Vietnam fighting coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and every time he got drenched, he said he went and tried to get water on himself, dip himself in the river or whatever. Those children who are now grown up, they cannot marry outside of other Agent Orange kids because it's a law of the communist government. They want to keep the gene pool isolated so that they will eventually die out, and they won't spread this vicious anomaly to other Vietnamese. So I think I know Brian got a great connection to the Vietnamese people and to those that were helping him in the search, and I think in many ways he's much closer to them now than he is to his own comrades, even though he goes every year to Caloundra for the reunion. You can sort of sense, Trina and I were up there last May when they have the anniversary each year, and like old diggers, they roll up there and drink and have their company, and then the bigger regiment things. There's a lot of animosity towards Brian, as well as there's a lot of support. I'd say it's almost a 50-50 division between those that still see the Vietnamese as the enemy, happy to have them buried, and the gooks, the Charlie, the commie bastards that they wanted to kill, and they kind of think that Brian's a soft cock in vernacular terms, and there's others that have made the journey back to Vietnam as well and realised in I guess lefty propagandistic terms or their own terms that they were used basically in the bigger picture, real politic of what happened and how things worked out for them, and they are quite happy for Brian and what he's doing and support him, and you could feel the ice in the room when one of the second lieutenants who was on the front line at Balmoral supported Brian at the last year's reunion and what he was doing in trying to bring the bodies back to their relatives.
What was the circumstance in which you first showed him the finished film? Was it just the 2 of you in a room? Was it a public showing?
No, it was, we thought it was really important to give Brian the first viewing of it, so we flew him over 2 or 3 days before we had the screening at the Chevelle in Sydney. Jenny, the co-producer, was there with me. Andrew Aristides, the editor, that worked very closely with it, and Brian and I, and we saw it, and he just gave me like that and leaned over and gave me a warm shake of the hand and said, you've done it. He had faith in me on the one hand, and he wanted to be at the reenactment scenes in Camden to have he's a bit of a control freak, is Brian, and that's fair enough. But I had a sixth sense that we only had 6 nights or 5 nights, as it turned out, to recreate those battle scenes, and I knew from the technicians that I had, who said, we're never going to get through all this, David. I knew if I had Brian there with his pedantic nature, that we wouldn't get through it anywhere near as much as we did. So I brought in Johnny Bryant, the forward scout that pissed on the machine gun, and Paul Donnelly, who was sort of, oh, what are we going to do now? Like that, you know, that he was cool, calm and collected. And another vet, Mel Davison, who said he had images of those hordes at Korea coming across the open fields. And I had those 3 guys there for the first 3 nights or the 5 nights to touch base with them. But I knew my story really well. I'd really done a lot of research by speaking to about 12 or more veterans at Balmoral, and I counterpointed each of their storytelling about what someone else told me. If there was a question mark, I went back to get it ruthlessly right, and then I wrote the drama scenes. Very little talking because that was going to slow us up, and basically reenacted it at Camden, south of Sydney, in the winter of last winter, June, where the temperatures dropped down to 7 degrees centigrade, which was nothing like 35 degrees centigrade at night time, 50 kilometres north of Saigon, where the actual battle took place. But the simple reason I did that was we would have had about 8 or 9 communist minders saying, you can't do that, you can't show us being defeated in this battle. So we took a quick early decision, which was the right decision to do it in Australia.
Question?
Close their doors.
Most definitely. I don't belong to an RSL now. I used to belong to an RSL. I belong to an Army Association in Balna.
Yeah.
But I do not belong to the RSL now, because I think the RSL now has lost the plot and what it's supposed to be. The RSL today is a big business. It's not there for the people. The only people that ever did anything for veterans was the Vietnam Veterans Association. They worked very, very hard to get all the benefits for veterans. The RSL, in my opinion, just blows along in the wind with whichever Liberal or Labor in power, and that's all they worry about. They don't worry about the returned servicemen. They're a lost cause, I'm sorry to say, and I think in the end they will die out.
Question?
David, when did you first meet and start talking to Vietnam vets, and has your understanding of what they went through, what point were you at when you first started meeting Vietnam vets? For myself, I knew many more young men who'd been conscientious objectors or had not served. It wasn't until I actually, 10 years after the war ended, got to meet and know a Vietnam vet that I actually started to feel compassion for what they'd gone through. I'm just wondering what your experience has been.
Yeah, well, my experience was more that Vietnam, I went to the ANU in Canberra in 1970 as a Bible bashing Baptist, and I believed in that. I believed in it.
It's a very internal one.
I believe in the domino theory. I believe that we should be in Vietnam, and so at the ANU, and I lived in a college where we had many a debate. I had a mate of mine. We were the conservatives were fighting a rearguard action with copious amounts of claret and a couple of joints every now and then, as we try to justify our position, and our friends went off to demonstrate against the Vietnam War. It's 1970, so the war is tailing off, and Australia is out of it like America by 1972, but it was still a pretty ferocious issue. I never felt comfortable to jump sides in terms of I sort of segued into land rights issue, was involved in the tent embassy at Old Parliament House when it was broken up. I got arrested there and slipped out of the arrest by Constable Miller because I was paranoid about my Plymouth Brethren father and my Baptist mother reading the newspaper that their son had been arrested at a demonstration, and so on. So I resisted arrest and got away with it. And I got myself very involved in the Springbok anti-apartheid issue as well. That kind of fitted with my Christian sort of belief system, even though I was rejecting that with sex, drugs and rock and roll kicking in a big way.
You're a very confused boy.
Yeah, I was a very confused puppy. That's right, yeah. And so it wasn't until I came to, but then I met Neil Davison making my first film Frontline in 1978-79. And Neil went more with his Vietnamese soldiers, the Arvin soldiers. He didn't go with the Australians, even though he was Australian. And he really wanted to cover the war from the Asians' point of view, which is what he did. He felt more comfortable with them than with his own compatriots.
Is that what you meant when you said the other day that the ghost of Neil Davis was in this film?
Yeah, basically, yeah, because I kept the camera rolling no matter what. When Brian walked in off the street, I really studied religiously the Vietnam War as a result of looking for all the archival footage that Neil had shot and were in the archives of the ABC back in 1979 when I was researching and getting the footage as a backdrop to Frontline. And Neil was my teacher. I was 28 years of age when I made Frontline. I'd been over to Europe. I'd been involved in the Spring Revolution of Portugal, which was a peaceful revolution. I went to Greece 1 month later when the generals overstayed the mark and the Greek generals were overthrown. And I was wanting to get on a plane to fly to Cyprus and be in the action and that. But I was so glad when I couldn't get a ticket to go to Cyprus because I might get killed. I've been up in the jungles of New Guinea on the border with Irian Jaya and New Guinea and got malaria and thought, shit, I'm not bulletproof after all, I can actually maybe die. So I was looking for Neil, as it turned out, and then Wilfred Birch, where we did get ambushed in Cambodia on the second film. I was looking for someone to be my mentor, my guide, to take me into how do you go into war zones or where history is being made on the cutting edge and survive, and Neil provided that. So Neil was very much and is very much the spirit that's in the background of the making of the Crater. Back about a month ago and had a screening at the Australian Embassy there where people were invited. We'd like to get Miss Hung, who provided that wonderful poetry at the very start of the film where she said they were too young to be fighting, they should be making love with their girlfriends, having babies, going to school in the arms of their mothers and so on. She is an interesting story. I mean, the same stories as you would know in making a film. Her uncle was disappeared or went missing fighting against the French. And she's what Brian calls the keeper of the books. She's in Hanoi and she gets all the correspondence and all the collation of all the families that are looking for their loved ones who were killed in the first Indochina War against the French, or the American War as the Vietnamese call it. And she made herself known to Brian, or Brian made herself known to her. So we have got an invitation from her to do a Vietnam translation and to show it in Vietnam on television. They won't give any money for it. We'll happily show it, give it to them for their Veterans Day, which I think is in May sometime.
So how much trouble did you have getting the money, getting the backing for this?
It was a little difficult, but
particularly since, I mean, well, first question, when did you start trying to get it up?
Okay, well, I came back with that 4 hours of rushes from Perth and Brian.
And when was that?
That was in April 2012.
Right, okay.
And then, thanks to the efforts of Andrew Bambach, who I'd like to acknowledge in this room, as I'd like to acknowledge Susan Hayward, who did the transcripts, like to acknowledge Trina, who wrangled all the footage for me, like to acknowledge Michael Balson, who helped me put a number of the interviews with the Balmoral veterans together so that Andrew Stiddy's my long-time collaborator and film editor in Sydney had a starting chance, because you can imagine we've got literally hundreds of hours of interviews and 2 digs to Vietnam, interviews with the Vietnamese, and reenactments and archival footage. So Andrew Bambach brought it down from 4 hours to 19 minutes, which we then gave to the ABC. Phil Craig, who was parachuted in POM, who'd been in the RAF in England, good guy, good filmmaker. He saw it, loved the 90-minute interview and said, okay, I want this to happen for the Anzac centenary in 3 years' time. Then it took me about 18 months of living on borrowed money from family and friends as the bills came in and we had no money to keep on going. And then finally, which is unusual because with the new ABC, as you would know as well, Kerry, I don't want to have a side swipe at the ABC tonight because the film did get made thanks to the ABC and Screen Australia and your taxpayer dollars that got it over the line. But it's a new ABC we're dealing with now. It took 18 months while they chiselled the contract, whereas I'm used to 3 months and you get the contract and you sign the dotted line and you get the money. And we had to go to Vietnam because Brian was fighting against the wet season and getting over there. So we did that with a bit of seed money from the ABC finally. I didn't have permission to go to Vietnam. The authorities were playing hardball. So I went over to tourist visa and with Brian's help and the locals on the ground, we charmed and schmaltzed our way in to about actually film the first dig, the same as we had to do on the second dig. But by that time, at least they knew about us. And I guess the most, in terms of the difficulty, but what I was really want to emphasise to the audience and where it's shown, I really want to show that Vietnamese side of it as well. It's like someone who Keith Murdoch or Ribbit's father or Charles Bean, who are correspondents at Anzac Cove and the Gallipoli battle, if they'd been able to go to the other side some years later and speak to the Turks about what it was like from their point of view and why they were fighting against these infidels that were invading their country, I really felt it was important, notwithstanding 46 years had gone by and the battlefield was overgrown with rubber trees and time has moved on. I wanted to get their side of the story as well, so I wasn't getting any cooperation from the Vietnamese authorities because their history of it is that they overran that American-Australian base, which was all Australians, and they went on and they had small casualties. In fact, as Brian says, judging by the blood stains on the grass and even the 42 they left behind, bearing in mind the Vietnamese communists didn't want to give any propaganda victories to the Americans or the Australians. They dragged the bodies away in the love of fighting. They had dedicated stretcher bearers who would run onto the field and they'd put a metal sort of rope around the ankle or the throat and drag the bodies off the battlefield, the wounded the same, so they wouldn't leave any bodies behind. So the fact they left 42 behind gives you an indication with Spooky, with 4 tanks that were there, with the artillery that were firing from 5 kilometres away, fire support base Coral, and 25 kilometres away with 155mm big guns, artillery pieces for the Americans to support it, helicopter gunships as well. There must have been hundreds on the 2 nights of battle of poor Vietnamese teenagers who were forced by their political commissars to go and get those bastards under the wire, get through there at any cost to overthrow them and to continue the march down to Saigon. So, I mean, the film, in the light of that, doesn't do justice to what that ferocity of that battle was and the battle for Coral that had taken place 2 weeks before that. And you can understand why both sides are traumatised by that battle and what happens in war in that instance. And, you know, I mean, that was like World War I and World War II. Vietnam was, in fact, for most of it, a guerrilla war where there were quick actions of what they call a firefight, a guerrilla ambush the Australians would set, or they'd stumble into an ambush by the Viet Cong. There'd be 30 seconds a minute of fighting and intensity and adrenaline rushes, and then the Viet Cong, with 1 or 2 dead, would piss off out of there, and the Australians would call in helicopter gunships to pursue them in artillery, and they would pursue themselves. It was all over. This was a set-piece battle over those 2 nights that Brian and his comrades and the Vietnamese took place in.
How did you get was it old Spooky? How did you get that footage?
That's all CGI, which is computer graphic generated, which means Al Moore, a guy that technician in his bedroom or his office cum lounge room in Coogee with computers and lots and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours. A little bit Asperger's, I think, between you and I on the go for this. Just determinedly worked on getting that right. And on the night when we did it, we sort of had little lights that he put. I haven't done, as Kerry said, I'm used to being a one-man band, but I had 40 technicians and a cast of 60.
Has it gone to your head?
Pardon?
Has it gone to your head?
Has it gone to, no, I love the idea of doing drama.
I'll bet you
and
do.
I love being Cecil B. DeMille. I didn't have a bullhorn like that, but it was pretty anxious-ridden because I had so much I wanted to get through.
Now, is this the first time you've gone to that degree? The
Yeah.
first time it's been that ambitious in terms of the direction, the production, just the size of it?
Yeah, I've done a little doco-drama here in Byron with Mandy Nolan and Ostentatious, Dylan, my son, playing a 17-year-old high school geek that didn't want to go to Roxby uranium mine with his dad, Ostentatious. But and Tony Barry held my hand with that. It was a 2-day shoot, but this was big time. This is a mate of mine that came out from Hollywood, the big arc lights, technicians, 3 lighting trucks, and an interesting story about getting the Vietnamese to play communists, because these were actually anti-communist sons and grandsons of Arvin, who you would know. They hated the communists. To get them to actually put on the uniform of the enemy, and their fathers, these 18, 19, 20-year-old kids from the Villawood Martial Arts School at Cabramatta in Sydney, to get them to put on NVA uniforms with helmets and to charge Australian lines, who actually were their friends in the real story. That was some effort in itself. That's maybe another story, but a lot of smooth talking and showing, again, Frontline. I took Frontline to their martial arts school and showed it to them. And once they saw that film, and this is a young generation of young men and a woman who loved Bruce Lee movies, who's 23 years of age, and her husband, whose father was an army officer who came out as a boat person from Vietnam, escaping communism, thanks to Malcolm Fraser and a compassionate government who allowed the boat people from Vietnam to come here. He's who run the martial arts school. They saw Frontline. They saw the sincerity of what I was doing, which was not a political film, but an anti-war film where all sides get screwed over. They said, "Okay, David, we're with you. We'll do it." And they jumped over gopher wombat holes, and one guy twisted his ankle, and they ran at the Australian lines. And at one point, we had to tell them, "Hold up, guys! You're doing too good a job." Actually, nearly overran the army reservists. And they were guys from Iraq and Afghanistan who had actually seen combat in Vietnam, Kerry, and they actually lined up to sort of, because they still gun-ho, they love guns and they love war toys and that. We recruited them through the Army Reserve newspaper, and they signed up about a month before, and I had these workshops with them at Fox Studios to school them in playing the roles of what they did. So we only had 2 actual actors who were trained as actors in the film. David Bradbury, who played, did a brilliant job of playing Brian Cleaver's character, and Andrew, who played Johnny Bryant, the guy that said, "Get fucked, I'm not going to get over there," like that. They're the only 2 actors we actually had. Dylan, my son, played the soldier that ran over and pushed his own brother Bibby down into the pit when he got a load of shrapnel in his eye, and then went and nursed Barry Bryan, whose comrade Lindsay Brown was dying in his arms. And I might be his dad, but I was very proud of the role that Dylan played in that film. We've got a study guide that's been written for high schools, and the film we've sent out in anticipation of the ABC screening on Thursday night, 9:30 p.m, ABC 1. Send it out virally to your friends, Twitter, Facebook, or whatever, and get your nieces and nephews to watch the film by all means, your kids to watch it.
Is anyone tweeting tonight?
Is there anyone tweeting tonight?
I thought it'd be a room full of tweets.
A poll straw, yeah. It's going to go into, it is, we've alerted the teachers to press the record button on Thursday night, which they'll do. There'll be 5 screenings on the ABC plus iView afterwards for 2 weeks each. That's 10 weeks. If people don't, and teachers don't get the opportunity to know what it's about, and that's where we rely upon. That's why I've done the Whistle Stop tour from Sydney, Adelaide, Perth, and so on, to create this sort of ripple effect, relying upon social media. People like yourself to say, I must get my gun-ho nephew or son to watch it. You know, I mean, you can only do so much, and that's part of my frustration as an ageing parent and a filmmaker, that the very people I want to watch it, that need to learn that, you know, before they sign up to go off to Afghanistan or to a looming possible conflict in Southeast Asia, or hating the towel heads or whatever like that, or justifying going in to fight against ISIS in Iraq and so on. I want those people to see it, but you know, that's a difficult question. It's a long-term thing. My job is, as filmmakers, to make the film and hope that other people, including yourselves, will spread the word and get it out, and that's what we can only hope for.
Can I say it's terrific to see a strong body of people turning out to see the story and to hear from David a lot of what has driven him and Brian, who've driven the film, and to give us some real insights to the whole process, David. Thank you very much for that, and thank you for coming.
Yeah.